Good evening. I'm Janet Harris, President of the Indiana Council on World Affairs. This opening slide is a photo from our Indiana Council on World Affairs Academic World Quest this recent Saturday on February 14th. Such youth enthusiasm for world affairs is very hopeful for a better world. This evening is the third of our 8-week series featuring the Foreign Policy Association's Great Decisions for 2026. To inform our discussion, we offer the Great Decisions book at educational discount from indianaworld.org. Distinctive to our Indiana Council on World Affairs Great Decisions series are the informed, nonpartisan lectures with Q&A presented by experts on the respective topics. To introduce our speaker and moderator for this evening's program about Ukraine and European security is Dr. Betty Townsend, who, with council members, has organized this Great Decisions 2026 series. Dr. Townsend.
Thank you, Janet. Some of you might remember about 4 years ago, this very month, we had Ambassador Oksana Makarova on, the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States. And it was really a remarkable evening. It was one of our largest audiences because everybody was absolutely on pins and needles, no one more than the ambassador. And what was remarkable was that she was there because everyone knew, as we were all holding our collective breaths, that Putin had advanced his tanks and his soldiers up very close to the border and was threatening to attack Ukraine, an unprovoked attack. And she was, of course, saying, as all of Ukraine was saying, no, he's not going to. We're still holding on. But she came and she spoke, and she would have had every reason not to, because surely this woman had many more important things to do. She shared with us that evening that she, however, I think one of the draws for coming here with the Indiana Council of World Affairs was that she'd done her master's in international relations at Indiana University. And she was really glad, if she couldn't put her feet back on Hoosier soil, she was really glad to be back among Hoosiers. And we were thrilled to have her with us. It was a wonderful and delightful evening in terms of just that alone, but it was also a very thoughtful evening. And surely then within days after she was with us, Putin did attack. And we've spoken about Ukraine again, and we're doing so tonight because the issue is still with us. With reduced support for NATO and Ukraine, Europe faces strategic uncertainty. The Trump administration has signaled an intention to reduce its security in Europe. And we are going to ask, what are America's stakes in NATO and Europe's strategic dilemmas and how Europe might exceed? And we are also thrilled that Erin Rosenberg is back with us this evening. She was here about 2 or 3 years ago, a profound expert in this, and we're glad she's back. She's the perfect person. Our moderator will be introducing Erin, our speaker, and I am going to introduce our moderator, a remarkable woman in her own right. Svetlana Raymer is Dr. Svetlana Raymer is president of the Ukrainian Society of Indiana. She was born and raised in Ukraine and moved to the U.S. in 2008 for graduate school. She holds a BS from the Kyiv National University, MS from East Carolina University, and a PhD from Penn State, with her research focused on Ukrainian diaspora in the U.S. Dr. Raymer has dedicated herself to the field of international relations, first as a college professor and a TEDx speaker, and then as vice president of development and external affairs at the International Center, the Communications for Ukraine Management Unit at DAI Global, and now as the content and editorial manager of Zone for Ukraine. She founded the Ukrainian Society of Indiana to serve Ukrainian Hoosiers and Friends of Ukraine through cultural, educational, and civic projects, and she also serves as Ukraine's honorary consul to Indiana. She frequently does return to Ukraine in this capacity. For her work, Svetlana has been awarded the role of honorary consul of Ukraine to Indiana, as well as the 2024 Emerging Leader of the Year by the United Way of Central Indiana and the 2024 Global Impression Award winner by the International Center. And Svetlana is going to introduce our speaker. And I think, as you know, we will be finished in 45 minutes in. It will be going to a public Q&A. We'll let you know as we get closer to that. So put your questions into the chat. If you feel it's disabled and you say that, just look for, I believe, everyone, but let us know in the chat if you have an issue, because we want to make sure we get your questions. All right, Svetlana.
Thank you so much, Betty. And I would like to note that we have further relied upon Ambassador Markarova's connection to Indiana, because we were able to get her out to Indiana in May of 2024 for the Indiana Global Economic Summit, where she had a bilateral meeting with Governor Holcomb, which led to then signing of a sister state agreement between Indiana and a region in Ukraine. I was honored to accompany Governor Holcomb on his trip to Ukraine to do so. And it was that visit to Indiana that she also used to hold the installation ceremony for me as the honorary consul. Normally, honorary consuls have to travel to DC, to the embassy, to do so. But I was very lucky that we actually got the ambassador here instead of me having to go there. Thank you for such a warm introduction and a warm welcome. And it is a great pleasure to introduce our speaker for the evening, Erin Rosenberg. Erin is a very impressive individual. She is an attorney specializing in international criminal law, reparations, and genocide prevention. Her work truly sits at the intersection of lived experience and accountability. So not just legal theory, but justice as it unfolds in real life for real people. She works directly with 4 conflict-related sexual survivor networks in Ukraine. And she was most recently in Ukraine in November of 2025 for the launch of the Survivors Call to Action, which is an initiative pressing Europe to prioritize justice, reconstruction, and meaningful reparations for Ukraine. Her work engages directly with the Council of Europe's Registry of Damages, a very important mechanism, and broader questions of how accountability mechanisms can support long-term recovery in Ukraine. Erin also serves as an expert for Council of Europe's consultation group on the children of Ukraine, where she examines this really, really important issue of forcible deportation, militarization, and Russification of Ukrainian children. This is an issue that reveals not only grave human rights violations, but I think a much deeper misunderstanding in Europe about Russia's true aims in Ukraine and their just worldview and the methods of warfare to which they're willing to sink. Tonight, she really brings a perspective that challenges us to think about European security, not just in military terms, but also through lens of justice, of deterrence, even occupation policy and forcible relocations of people, and the consequences of international community's response, or lack thereof, since 2014. So Erin, such a pleasure to have you. And since I mentioned that you were in Ukraine just very recently, and we actually overlapped a little bit with our last visit, I was there mid-October through early November, and you were there a little bit later. I think to set the scene for everyone on the call, if you would be willing to share a little bit about your visit, what you experienced, what you saw, give us some field notes from your recent visit for us to understand what's truly going on.
Well, thank you so much, Svetlana, for that introduction and this question. I would start by saying, maybe just to add that I was most recently in Ukraine in November, and then was before that there in July. And one of the connecting things that I think is important to say up front, and I was, of course, in Kyiv, is that the degree of, through both missiles, the Shahed missiles, of course, being used, but also drones, used as a form of psychological, I wouldn't say torture, but as essentially mistreatment, is one of the, I think, things that is not talked about, but when you actually experience it, the timing, the fact that you are in a bomb shelter beginning at 7, 9, potentially 10. And then throughout the night, you will have waves of attacks coming in to where you get up in the morning and are quite exhausted and find it sort of difficult to get going. And it's just something I wanted to mention because I think that because of the way the media covers Ukraine, that there is an idea that it's not so much in the news of what is happening. And one of the things that I really want to emphasize is that the bombing campaigns targeting specifically civilian infrastructure, apartment buildings, energy grids, is happening constantly and actually has been on a massive uptick since the United States, since President Trump's decision first to halt the provision of Patriot missiles, which are part of the defense system, and then to indicate a lack of support for Ukraine. So that's one of the things that becomes very clear when you're there. This is not a stalemate. This is not a frozen war. Russia is attacking throughout Ukraine. Obviously, the front lines are very different, but all the way to Kyiv itself from an aerial assault, and it is incredibly dangerous and disruptive to life, daily life. The other thing that I would say to move to when I was there in November was that I was there the week before and crossing through Thanksgiving. So those of you who follow what the United States does, this was the period where President Trump had essentially tried to pressure Ukraine to agree to a peace agreement that was going to be announced on Thanksgiving. And there was all of this talk in the news of, 3-day agreement. We had negotiations that Ukraine was completely excluded from. And we had initially the 28-point plan put forward. And that is the time that I was there. So as you mentioned, I was working directly with 4 survivor groups of conflict-related sexual violence, 2 of which are mainly women, 1 primarily from occupied Ukraine, and then 2 groups which are mainly men. Alumni are male members, they're POWs and civilian detainees. And the 29 December group as well, which is men and women. And I think one of the things that I want to say in terms of carrying their voice forward, because I was speaking with them while these peace negotiations were happening, was that the Russian and US position of amnesty as a part of the peace agreement, as well as the complete lack of inclusion of any requirement that detained Ukrainians be released and that Ukrainians forcibly deported to Russia be returned, really the emotional impact of a feeling of betrayal was what I truly felt from these survivors. That the idea of peace with really no justice in terms of their own experience, what they had gone through, what their communities had gone through, that this was unacceptable. And that maybe I will close by answering this because I don't go too long, is that they actually chose as a statement in terms of, they did a public event and they chose a phrase that they wanted for each speaker to incorporate into their remarks, no matter what the question was. And it was people before territory, people before peace. And I think that is in terms of the resilience of the Ukrainian people, but also the deep sense that there needs to be true recognition of what has happened. There needs to be accountability. There also does need to be peace, but it needs to come with a recognition of what happened, not purely for justice, but also in order to ensure that this does not repeat.
Thank you so much, Erin. I really appreciate you sharing about the constant and unrelenting attacks. And as you probably know, and we'll share with our guests on the call, that the situation in Kyiv specifically has gotten a lot worse since Erin and I have both been there, especially with the January 9th attack and subsequent attacks that have taken out most of the city's power grid.
Yeah.
And with the profoundly like -4 Fahrenheit temperatures, people's apartments on the inside were covered in ice and frost. People had no running water, no heat, no electricity for weeks on end. Uh, and it's a full-on humanitarian catastrophe. And there have since been recorded instances of people freezing to death in their apartments in Kyiv, mostly the elderly who have individuals with limited mobility, but it had become so cold in their apartments and they couldn't leave and they couldn't seek help that they just perished from the cold in their apartments. And Erin, it's so valuable that you are working with these survivor networks and that you're carrying their voices forward and truly showcasing what that accountability would look like, what they're asking the world community, the European community to prioritize, which is people over territory, over some haphazard peace deal.
Yeah.
Another phrase that I hear from Ukrainian officials and people frequently is nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine.
Yeah.
That was another big thing of all these negotiations and the 28-point plan that was done without Ukraine. We are not an object of this. Ukraine is a subject in this. And so with that, something that I think when we connected previously that was very interesting that you shared, that throughout the full-scale invasion, Europe has taken a very specific stance and it has assumed a very specific role in how it saw itself being useful and helpful in assisting Ukraine. Can you share a little bit about your experience of what this stance is, and also your opinion on how effective it is, and how good this stance and how helpful this stance is?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And maybe to add a little bit where this comes from. So I worked at the International Criminal Court for a decade, and Ukraine, I'm not going to get into all the explanation of the specifics of how they were requesting the court's intervention, but basically the annexation of Crimea and then the occupation triggered what's called a preliminary examination at the International Criminal Court. So I had been meeting with Ukrainian survivor groups and representatives from around 2017, I think, is when we started really having engagements. And that sort of sets the stage, I suppose, is that my first engagement with also European member states of the International Criminal Court coming to speak about Ukraine was very much from an international legal perspective of what can the court do, what is the prosecutor's office doing, what are the investigations. That is, in my view, what the European Union has continued to do primarily in terms of their view of how they could pressure Russia. When I'm going to be a little bit technical, but I think this is maybe important to understand. When the full-scale invasion happened in 2022, what the European primary response was to make what are called referrals to the ICC, which essentially moves something from an examination stage to a full-on investigation, meaning it brings it closer to charges being laid. And this was a huge campaign by the European Union, led by the United Kingdom, France participating, the Netherlands, Germany, almost all of the EU countries. And it was something that they invested a tremendous amount of political capital in, which led, for those who are familiar with the work of the ICC, eventually to an indictment against Putin. Outside of that, the European Union has focused, and we see this from the Council of Europe, on two other aspects. One is in terms of creating a standalone tribunal for the crime of aggression, which is a crime that is not currently able to be prosecuted by the ICC. And second is, as you mentioned, with the registry of damages, the seizure of, so this is about assets freezing Russian assets, which I think we're all familiar with the with that occurring, but as then it becomes a question of freezing is one thing, seizure is another, and then of course actual use is another. These are all sort of escalatory points. The main, I suppose, to sort of wrap up what all of these activities are about Europe positioning itself as the defender of international law, primarily, in seeking to use international law and economic, through the seizure of assets, economic pressure, as opposed to strong military and defense support to Ukraine. I obviously work in international law. I work in the field of justice, but I would simply say that when we look at Nuremberg came about after the war, World War II was over. And Nuremberg would not have happened if the Allies had not won the war. And it would not have been, to be very blunt, a good use of the Allies' time to be focusing on creating Nuremberg rather than winning World War II. I believe that Europe has over-focused because they have over-relied on the military strength of the United States as being the ones who would provide the necessary military response, to focus much more on legal deterrence and economic deterrence. And ultimately, both of those avenues have not deterred Putin. They have not deterred the Russian Federation. And we have seen most recently with the decision not to use the seized assets for reconstruction, that in fact, the weak security position of the European Union has made it so that it kind of played a bluff that failed in terms of the seized assets. So I realize that I don't mean to sort of shock people as we start this conversation. I believe very strongly in international law. I believe in the ICC. I believe that the Russian Federation has committed a number of international crimes and that there needs to be justice. But I think that the European Union has way too over-focused and presented itself as the peaceful counterpart to the United States instead of truly taking serious its need to defend a European country, namely Ukraine.
Thank you, Erin. This is really profound, and I really appreciate you saying this in such blunt terms. And I think this is something that you and I discussed. You can't prosecute and put Putin on trial until until you cannot drag him to the Hague, and you cannot drag him to the Hague until there is a military victory in Ukraine. And I really love the example that you brought of Nuremberg and how, learning from the past and understanding, if the Allies hadn't won, there wouldn't have been that justice moment and that legal moment. We can certainly learn a lot from history and from things that have been done right, like in the example you gave, win first, judge second, and things that have not been done right. And so this is where I really wanted to get your perspective on Europe's stance in 2014 and America as well, President Obama as well, when Russia annexed Crimea, and how the responses of that time have informed what we see in the world today.
Yeah, so that's why I always get slightly uncomfortable with the framing of the full-scale invasion as kind of the starting point, because I think it's actually necessary to go back to 2014 and to look at the way that Europe and the United States, and Russia for that matter, are all behaving, and what kind of reaction there was. And I think the reality is that, and this is not just, let's say, this is not just Ukraine. This is also, I think, very, very similar to if we look back at Georgia in 2008, where the message, if you will, the political message of state sovereignty, right, as a core principle of the international framework and our legal order, was not, in territorial borders, was not actually defended. And I think that the reality is that with the annexation of Crimea and then the subsequent occupations, that there was actually a great deal of tolerance so long as it remained a portion of Ukraine. And there was very little political will or appetite for a full defense and expulsion of not just Russian forces, but then of course the subsequent Russian citizens who were brought in. I mean, and certainly in terms of Crimea, you have the actual transfer of Russian population to Crimea with the transfer of homes, property, everything. So now you have a very large Russian civilian population, actually. And I think the lesson from that is that the non-reaction and the refusal to defend vociferously the borders of Ukraine really emboldened Russia and are very much why we saw the escalation in 2022.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing it so clearly. And I wanted to add that what you've described, what's happening in Crimea with the Russian population, it is estimated that over 1 million Russian civilians have moved into Crimea since 2014. Many of them have taken over apartments of Ukrainians. I know personally people who used to live in Crimea and left when the occupation happened. They didn't want to obtain Russian passports. They didn't want to live in Russian Federation. And they know for sure that their apartments were seized. Their private property was seized, and they just changed the locks and handed it over to Russian citizens. And this is very similar. And I know that a lot of folks here are very, very inclined and interested in history and lessons and understanding the precursors of things. And I hope this will be valuable for you. If you weren't, you wouldn't be here today. But I encourage you to also look into the issue of Holodomor, which is the Ukrainian famine genocide of 1932 and 1933, when the Soviet regime took away all of grain and foodstuffs from Ukraine and manufactured an artificial starvation. In about a year and a half, between 7 and 10 million ethnic Ukrainians died, mostly in central and eastern Ukraine. And then Russian citizens from Russian Soviet Socialist Republic were relocated into the empty villages where all Ukrainians died out. And so when people ask, why do so many people in Eastern Ukraine speak Russian? Why do they have such a cultural affinity for Russia? Surely that is because that part of Ukraine is meant to be with Russia. That could not be further from the truth if you look 90 years back in history. So I very much encourage you. Anne Applebaum's Red Famine is a phenomenal work on the matter. So if you take one book recommendation from this. Erin, one of the things I would like to also discuss, because this is an issue in the US that probably, at Razom, where I work, we have an advocacy team located in DC, and they work on a variety of issues, but probably no issue related to Ukraine has more strong bipartisan support as the issue of abducted Ukrainian children. And even First Lady Melania Trump has, written a letter to President Putin that President Trump gave him during the Alaska summit. She has also personally overseen at least one repatriation of, I believe, about 15 Ukrainian teenagers from Russia back to Ukraine. There was a hearing in Congress that just was packed to the gills, where witnesses and NGOs were talking about and showing pictures of Ukrainian children in North Korean militarization camps. So Russians don't just take them away from Ukraine, but they send them as far as North Korea to be re-educated. And so but this is an issue that mostly is talked about from the standpoint of humanitarian concerns. But what does this mean for our broader understanding of Russia's methods of warfare and its imperialist ambitions towards not just Ukraine, but a lot of other pieces of Europe.
Well, that's exactly right. And I think it's really important to identify the forcible transfer, which would be within Ukraine itself, forcible deportation, meaning into Russia, and all of the filtration camps, the Russification that occurs as a method of warfare, which methods of warfare are regulated by the Geneva Conventions, and this would be a illegal method of warfare prosecutable as a war crime, which is actually what Putin was charged with. So I think that understanding it from a military perspective is incredibly important to begin with in terms of what it is. There are very important, I do want to say, and this is also true about the failure to respond in 2014 and 2015, that there are very serious and profound issues that arise from forcible deportation of children and the forced adoption of them in terms of reconciliation, in terms of national reconciliation and rehabilitation, that I think is important to talk about from a humanitarian perspective. But from a sort of military perspective, I think that it's not an oddity. And that's important to recognize, that it is a feature of a method of warfare that is used by Russia that gives us a glimpse, exactly as you said, into their imperialist approach to Ukraine, which is essentially a denial of the existence of a Ukrainian national identity. And I think Europe and the United States both have shied away from recognizing that Russian view, and have maintained a facade that Russia recognizes Ukrainian national identity, the Ukrainian state, when in fact, the rhetoric of Russian leadership, of Putin himself, Russian media makes very clear that this is not true. And I think also, I do want to add to this, because I'm sure this came up in the hearing, so I didn't hear it. I was at Georgetown actually for a conference on this very topic. And one of the things we talked about is what we are now seeing, because of the length of time of the occupation and the failure of the international community to put an end to the occupation, is that we are now seeing Ukrainian, at the time, children who were brought to Russia, who were adopted, who are now being sent to Ukraine as a part of the Russian military. There's something deeply just very, very horrifying of that. But that's a reality of what is happening. And I think that for outside of Ukraine, that when we think about threats to particularly Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union countries, that there needs to be a clear-eyed recognition that Putin in particular, and the Russian Federation under his leadership, views those countries and those populations as Russian.
Absolutely. Yes, this is, that's what I'm also finding through the work of the Razum advocacy team, is that is an issue that is at the front, and that there's a lot of effort by Save Children UA and Bring Kids Back campaign to ensure that no peace negotiation can be settled without a clear plan for returning these Ukrainian children, and some of them, as you mentioned, now teenagers. We're starting to see a lot of really good questions pop into the chat, but I wanted to address a comment that I saw about Holodomor and how important of a page of Ukrainian history it is. The repercussions of that event into breaking Ukraine's identity and breaking the resistance of Ukrainian farmers and landowners against the communism and collectivization and being put in collective farms. It's really, it has a lot of effects that we see even today, even in the health of Ukrainians, when a nation goes through a mass starvation event, especially if it's artificial and violent. it has a lot of repercussions for kind of how they process things and how they process trauma. And so, like I said, for anyone who's interested into looking deeper, Red Famine by Anne Applebaum, Execution by Hunger is a book by Meron Dolot, very difficult to read, eyewitness account. If you're more of a movie buff, Bitter Harvest, it's a film, it's a Canadian film about the famine genocide, as well as Mr. Jones. It's a movie about Gareth Jones, a Welsh journalist who snuck into Ukraine and tried to tell the world about Holodomor, about what was happening. And he was actually discredited by Walter Duranty, who was the New York Times lead editor in Moscow at the time, and he was corrupt, and he was bought by the Soviet government, and he discredited Gareth Jones. And there's actually a big movement amongst Ukrainian journalists to strip Walter Duranty of his Pulitzer Prize because of how many Ukrainian lives he cost through his lies, through covering up a mass genocide event. Erin, I'm really curious to hear, you alluded to this a little bit through the work that you do with the survivor networks, but also as Europe thinks about, wanting to end things, there's this real danger of playing the scales between peace and justice. How should Europe think about moving forward in a way that doesn't prioritize peace over justice?
Well, I'm gonna sound like a conservative here, but I mean, I think it's peace through strength, and justice through strength. And I think that one of the reasons why I'm deeply concerned about Europe right now is because they are at quite a deficit, unfortunately. And I think that the non-diplomatic way in which the US administration speaks generally has been deeply offensive and upsetting to people. But the core message, I think, in Europe itself actually is now acknowledged as true, which is that Europe has really underfunded its own defense. And it finds itself now at a deep deficit. And even with increases in their defense spending, this is not something that, in a year can be turned around. So it's something that's much longer. And that's why I'm quite concerned for these negotiations, because Europe does not have the time to put itself in a strong position. Moving forward, I think that is the path, though, of in terms of the potential for a reinvasion, a re-outbreak of fighting, and certainly in terms of other countries. As unpalatable as the message of the Trump administration has been, I do actually think that, and certainly speaking with a number of people in Europe, within European governments, that there is actually a recognition that it is important that that Europe be able to defend itself, defend European countries without being so reliant on the United States. Now, for right now, in terms of the immediate, how does Europe do that? It's incredibly difficult, to be honest with you. It's incredibly difficult to see where Europe can really place pressure to make a constructive role in terms of ensuring both that there is an end to the war, but also that there is justice. And I think that because Europe has put itself in such a weak position, that ultimately it falls on the American people. And I would say to everyone here, communicate with your elected officials, communicate with your neighbors. America is in the driver's seat of this, and as Americans, we need to be engaged in terms of what agreement our country is putting forward for Ukraine. Yeah, I realize that's maybe a depressing answer for the immediate, but I think it's important to underline the degree to which the European Union has unfortunately really made itself a weak participant.
Thank you, Erin. And I wanted to emphasize your points with two quick examples. One, an article was circulated recently among Ukrainians that Ukrainian drone operators, like FPV drone operators, were invited to participate in joint NATO exercises. And it turned out to be a complete disaster for the NATO forces. Within, Ukrainians were playing the one side, and the NATO forces were playing a joint. International NATO forces were the adversary. And 10 Ukrainian FPV drone operators in the span of half a day were able to take out 2 battalions of NATO forces, showcasing how profoundly behind, not just in terms of defense spending, but understanding of modern warfare that's largely driven forth by drones. Yeah. They're not ready. They have giant, expensive tanks and BMPs and this and that, and a 500 FPV drone can take out your $12 million tank in 15 minutes. And so big, bulky stuff is no longer what's driving the warfare. Robotics and drone warfare is really it. Information technology is really it. And your other point about, American people being in the driver's seat, I think a very stark example of what just recently happened is a Ukrainian man who is legally in the United States on the Uniting for Ukraine program with his wife and 3 children, was detained by ICE in Minneapolis while he was working as a delivery driver, trying to make ends meet. He was picking up groceries at Walmart for a delivery, putting them in his trunk, and he was detained. He was explaining that he's here legally on U4U program, that he's running away from the war. And one of the ICE officers told him that he supports Russia and he thinks Russia should have Ukraine and Russia should win. So there is such an entity as Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, ROKOR, which is very, very active in America. There was recently a delegation of that went to Washington, D.C. One delegation from Russian Orthodox priests and one delegation from just civilians who were talking and spreading misinformation in the halls of Congress about the prosecution of Christians in Ukraine, which could not be further from the truth. So there's a because the United States is still the decisive strength factor, because Europe is so far behind, Russian disinformation in America is working. They're working overtime. They're working really hard. One final question, because I know we should be switching to questions from the audience. So just a little looking forward and maybe on a positive, hopeful note. As European leaders, if they truly want this security architecture after this invasion, if you could have your way, Erin, your hopes and dreams, what is one accountability mechanism or policy they should implement to really move things forward? If you could have your way and get them to do one thing, what would it be?
Well, I mean, okay, it would be that the seized assets would be used for not just reparations, but the reconstruction of Ukraine, and that the Council of Europe would move the start date and because right now the start date for the registry of damages is 2022, meaning that everyone who has suffered harm, everyone who lost property, all of the damages done prior to the full-scale invasion are excluded from this international mechanism. This is to me, it's one of them from a justice perspective, and in terms of acknowledging what's happened and not artificially dividing history, because you're decontextualizing the full-scale invasion if you don't actually date it from 2014. I also think for Ukraine itself, in terms of reconstruction, that it is very harmful to have 2022 as the dividing point of who is recognized. I think it's a divisive thing, and I think that um, the rehabilitation of the Ukrainian people has to be paramount. Um, right now, you have people who have lived their entire lifetime, teenagers, right, under Russian occupation. That is their reality, right? And there's a lot of reconciliation and national reconciliation that needs to happen because of the length of time that this has been allowed to go on. And that means we have to include all of the harms and all of the injustice from 2014. The European Union has these seized assets. Right now, Belgium and Belgian banks who hold most of the assets are the impediment. They got very close to pulling the trigger on it and they bailed. So that would be, I mean, because I think it is ultimately the European Union, it's going to take time to rebuild itself from a national security perspective, from a defense perspective. They do have economic power over Russia, but they have to use it.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. They really need to, at Razum also, we have a couple of senior legal fellows who specifically work on frozen Russian assets and transferring that for the reconstruction of Ukraine. I believe currently they're using the interest from them.
Yes.
But if we could take all of that Russian dirty oligarch money and use it for reconstruction of Ukraine, that would certainly be a lot better.
Yeah.
Thank you. Ray, I know that we have some phenomenal questions in the chat, so I'll hand things over to you to point them to me or Erin or whoever needs to answer them.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Well, I really enjoyed your conversation. I think you brought up some interesting points. Dave Wemhoff had a comment. So, Dave, if you want to kind of talk a little bit about what you're thinking with respect to your comment.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your presentation. Thank you very much, Dr. Raymer, and thank you very much, Erin Rosenberg. This is fantastic information. I believe that my comment was addressed by the doctor concerning the Holodomor. The only thing I would add is that I am saddened, that the community of nations of the United Nations, though it has passed all these resolutions, which is very good, condemning Russia, has perhaps not done more. We know from the history of the United Nations, and perhaps I'm being a bit of a dreamer here, but we know from the history of the United Nations that they have the power to do a lot of things, and I would hope the UN would consider doing more in the future. But I want to thank you, Dr. Rosenberg, for what you're doing. I want to thank you, Dr. Raymer, for what you're doing, and Slava Ukraini.
All right. Well, thank you very much, David.
Heroyam Slava.
Ray, if you don't mind, can I just maybe say something about what Dave said about the
sure
transfer of Russians? Yeah. And just in the comment, I want to just mention, because we didn't quite get into this with Svetlana, that one of the things that I think is really important to understand about what's happening with Ukrainian children in the Russification process is that once they become Russian, they're given new names. They're also given new passports. They're given new identity documents. They are completely untraceable. And this is something that Russia has to actually participate in. And it's a huge problem. I mean, these are children who have been adopted and given completely new names. So you cannot find them. And I just want to emphasize the real world consequences of what Russia has done in terms of the impacts on Ukrainian families, parents, and how difficult this is going to be to unwind if we don't make it a priority.
Thank you, Erin. Jim Strick has a question, but just I want to emphasize that if you have a question, please post it there and we'll get to you and make sure your questions get answered. So, but Jim, you want to go ahead?
Yes. Hi. I think that actually a lot of what I was saying in my question has been addressed, although I would be curious. I realize that it is woefully insufficient, but if these Russian assets in, I guess, largely in Belgium, but elsewhere in Europe as well, were to be used to defend Ukraine and to begin some sort of reconstruction, what are the impediments? Why are the Europeans so reluctant to use this obvious mechanism? Is it sure fear that they might be invaded themselves? Is there something else that I'm missing? Thank you.
So I can, I think if I give you another example, it'll make it make more sense. So when you had the renationalization of energy companies throughout Latin America, right? What the major oil companies did, and also this is also true in Africa, for example, what they did, right, is they went to the international arbitration. So international law again, but the economic system, and brought lawsuits. And in many cases, they won because of arguments that this, whatever sort of the policy reasoning behind a country renationalizing its energy infrastructure, that basically they had to, that those companies and many countries have judgments against them held by private oil companies, Shell. I mean, this is actually, if you follow what happened with Venezuela, this is a part of the history, right? So one of the main issues that Belgium has, and I shouldn't say it's Belgium, Belgium is acting on behalf of the banks, the Belgian banks that hold the money, is that they're deeply concerned, and Putin has been very clear that if these funds, so there, as I said, these are escalation points. Freezing assets doesn't mean, it just means you don't have access to your account, right? Seizure and then actual use is a very different thing. And there's a number of concerns that if a case were actually brought by one, whether these are Russian citizens, whether these are Russian state assets, that they would actually rule against the bank of following the EU instruction to give those assets, to remove those assets from the accounts where they are, and to actually give them to Ukraine. So there is a risk that that could happen, which is why you don't bluff if you're not going to do it, and you don't make it your primary, stick with your carrots and your sticks if it's not something that you really actually feel like you can do. If it's not something you can do, then don't threaten it, because when it's time to do it, you're going to be shown to not. And yeah, so it's basically that Belgian banks hold overwhelmingly more money than or assets than other countries, and they have concerns about losing in court.
And there's also fear of setting a precedent.
Yeah.
Right. If we think about the Nazi money in Swiss banks, it's the moment a bank gives away your money to a government, whatever the circumstances, you
Right.
stop trusting the bank.
Right.
Right. Even if you're a criminal, even if you did something wrong, the moment the bank takes your private property and gives it up for reconstruction, for whatever purposes, because you're now on the wrong side of history, nobody trusts you as a bank. Like your business, your entire business model is that people trust you with their money and trust that you won't give it to anyone but you. And so that's another fear, is that the reputation of these, old school, old European, old money banks in Switzerland and Belgium and the Netherlands, that sets a very dangerous precedent as well.
Yeah. And maybe to add to this, so the issue of, frozen assets and then actually seizing them is something that the US has actually dealt with in our court system a lot about Afghanistan. So when the Taliban came back into power most recently, from the national transitional government had a lot of Afghan assets so actual like the state assets were in U.S. banks. What President Biden proposed and what was endorsed by the federal courts was that those assets could not be transferred to the Taliban because as a terrorist organization, so they remain frozen, right? And that's legal for the United States to freeze them. But in terms of using them, that they could be used to support Afghan reconstruction done by UN actors and certain NGOs, excluding the Taliban, but that they could not be used, for example, to pay a judgment that was issued for September 11th. So that maybe gives a little more insight too, that the reason why they could be used by the United States after having seized them was because the benefit was going back to the Afghan people. But it really was quite, yeah.
All right, thank you. Gerald Mackay has got a question.
Yes, thank you, organizers. Thank you, Dr. Raymer. Thank you, Erin, for this talk. I have a comment and a question. First, Erin, you said you almost apologized for shocking us with your insights about the EU being over-focused, but I want to thank you for underscoring what I feel may be a lack of urgency regarding the rapid erosion of post-war international order from the current U.S. administration's public comments about NATO to challenges within the EU internally, the funding of far-right groups, challenges to national and EU efforts, going back to misinformation campaigns with Brexit, Greenland, sanctions against individuals at the ICC, the pulling of funding from the United Nations, the misnamed Council of Peace. So I'm concerned in part whether the EU and related institutions can sustain these well-funded, powerful attacks over time, and what the order may be in the midst of these changes. So thank you for underscoring what you see as some of EU's overfocus in some ways, in some aspects. My question, I don't know much, largely ignorant with respect to Ukraine's internal politics. There's been some pressure on Zelensky from the U.S. and questioning the legitimacy of the presidency with elections, the withholding of elections. I wonder if you can provide just a really brief insight. Is Zelensky at risk? What's happening internally in terms of politics?
And maybe, Gerald, thank you so much. And I'm going to actually ask Svetlana to answer the question on the internal politics. But I do want to just say something about the concerns you raised, because it's something that I think I share very strongly with you. And it is, I believe, a tragedy in many ways that international institutions such as the United Nations, such as the ICC, also Europe, have not taken advantage of the period from the late 1990s to about 2010 to really strengthen, be results oriented, and to build resilience. Resilience is what you have to do during the time that you are strong, so that when you are threatened, you can be resilient. And unfortunately, organizations and institutions that I care deeply about and who protect the very values that I believe in have, my own view of it is that for the past decade or so have not been thinking about, we need to be strong so that we can withstand any pushback. And we find ourselves at a stage where, exactly as you identify, a number of bad actors, a number of actors who fundamentally do not hold the same values around the legal order, around the value of international law, and the institutions have put themselves in a very weak position to respond. And so I don't mean to understate at all the threat or the value of these systems, but my own, having worked in them for the past 20 years, I have a tremendous amount of sadness at at how weak we are at this moment when we are truly at risk. And so with that, yeah, maybe I'll ask Svetlana if she wants to pick up on the second part.
Yeah, thank you, Erin, and thank you, Gerald, for a really, really good question, because that is something that has been discussed quite actively during various rounds of peace negotiations. And the one thing I want to sort of lay as groundwork, according to Ukraine's constitution and law, there are no elections during martial law. So that's I want to get the basics out of the way. Like, Zelensky is not breaking the law by not having elections in wartime. It's written in the law. I also find it profoundly ironic that the players who most loudly demand elections in Ukraine, such as Russia and Belarus, have had the same president for the past 25 years. I sure hope that's not lost on anyone. Now, Zelensky has also noted that as soon as a durable, reliable, trustworthy, security guarantee-backed ceasefire is achieved, he's willing to start an election process within 90 days. Like, he has said that repeatedly, he's willing to do it. He has also tried to address various concerns within his administration by doing multiple reshufflings of high-level public servants, including the most recent dismissal of his chief of staff, who was kind of like his right hand, Andriy Yermak. Right, he's been, placing new sort of fresh people, such as Mikhailo Fedorov, who was the Minister of Digital Transformation. He's now the Minister of Defense, because, as we found, digital technology has now become the forefront of defense. So he's trying to say, hey, I can't hold elections because law, but I'll try to do these other things to showcase that we are trying to, be responsive to the international community, which is much more than some other international players can say for themselves. Now, also imagine the mechanics. 20 to 22% of Ukraine's territory is occupied. Do those people vote? Are they stripped from their ability to vote? How would you conduct a vote on a temporarily occupied territory? Mail-in ballots? UN missions? Don't think so. How would you actually conduct something like that and truthfully represent the will of the people? Or do you hold the elections, don't include them? And Erin already noted there are people who have been living under occupation since 2014. They're holding on to their Ukrainian identity by a thread. And if we hold elections and say, actually, we don't care about you, we're going to hold elections of a new president and you won't be included, that is a severance of connection to a national identity and a country that would be almost final. So I don't know, what would you do if you were in that situation, right? It's an impossible, even if the active hostilities were to stop, even if the conflict was frozen at the current line of conflict, right? Like, I have no idea what it would look like logistically and in terms of mechanism to even do something like this without it being able to be challenged by international law itself. Did you include all of your citizens? You didn't. So yeah, it's just a very challenging thing.
All right. Well, thank you, Svetlana. Turned out to be a complicated question there, Jerry. All right. We have 3 questions in the queue here. So we'll start with Joanne Rudolph. You out there, Joanne? Maybe lost her here a second. Why don't we can skip to Donna first, and maybe we'll come back to Joanne.
I don't think Donna has a question. I think Donna was just sharing that her camera isn't working.
No, I think she did. Oh, maybe she did. Okay. Okay, then the Boswells.
No, I have no question. Sorry.
Okay, that's right.
I'm back. I'm Joanne Rudolph. I'm using her computer.
Okay, well,
I raised a question about the fact that political chaos in this country has, to some extent, eclipsed the disastrous invasion by Russia of a sovereign country. This is, as everybody here recognizes, this is a world historical moment. This is a turning point in the post-war order, in the concept of a sovereign state. And a small question, speaking as a journalist, what can American journalists or any journalists anywhere do to refocus attention on this catastrophe that's evolving in front of us?
I'll give you an example from my work, referring back to the same Razum advocacy team. One of the things that they have started to do is they are organizing delegation visits to Ukraine. They've organized a delegation of religious leaders, as including Pastor Burns. And then they also organized most recently a delegation of conservative journalists. Because I don't know if you remember the very first Oval Office meeting that didn't go too well.
It was a catastrophe.
When President Zelensky said, well, we welcome, do you know what's happening in Ukraine? And the response of Vice President Vance, just floored about anyone in the room, I think, was, no, but I've seen stories.
Right.
Well, if we all got our information from Instagram stories, what a world we would be living in. So the real work is to get people on the ground. So most recently, Razum took, I believe, 12 conservative journalists to Ukraine. They were able to meet with Ukrainian journalists, with civil society leaders, with religious leaders. They were able to visit a radio station in Dnipro that was bombed out, and see how their own colleagues are faring under the full-scale invasion. So these types of efforts, I think, are really valuable. Ukrainians themselves have started to create these sort of media notoriety opportunities. Most recent one, maybe you've heard about, was with a Ukrainian skeleton racer at the Olympics who had his helmet of remembrance. And it's really interesting because if the International Olympic Committee just let him race, he would be probably on the screen for about 30 seconds. I mean, skeleton has they do 4 runs and then just get the average time. And for some runs, they even don't show them at all because they go to commercial. But the Olympics themselves don't stop. So they might have not showed him at all. But because they forbade him to wear a helmet with depictions of Ukrainian athletes that died because of the Russian full-scale invasion. I mean, 2 girls in there, one is 11, one is 9. And they forbade him, they disqualified him and took his accreditation away for wanting to wear this helmet remembrance. That made front pages of the New York Times and the New York Post and a lot of other publications around the world. So Ukrainians have sort of also started to try to create these opportunities to be covered by the media through sometimes these sort of very intentionally manufactured conflict situations.
I have been to the Donbass twice and embedded with Azov most recently in 23. And I think it's terribly important to have eyes on the situation. It's got to continue. It has to continue. Thank you.
all right. Well, thank you. So Boswells, I believe you have a question.
Neither the U.S. nor Russia was a signatory to the ICC, so they'd have no standing to bring a case if we were to use the frozen assets. Who would bring a case?
So it wouldn't, no, that's a really good point. It wouldn't be brought to the ICC though. So this would be under the International arbitration system. So, which the banks are subject to. I will say though that I just do want to add that you're exactly right that Russia is not a member state of the Rome Statute, so they're not a part of the ICC system, but the way that jurisdiction works at the ICC is, in terms of personal jurisdiction, is nationality and territory. What that means is that, so Ukraine is a member state, which means that a Ukrainian, by virtue of being a national of Ukraine, if they were to commit a war crime, they could be prosecuted. The court would have personal jurisdiction. But the flip side of that is that what territorial jurisdiction means is that crimes committed on Ukrainian territory, regardless if the perpetrator is not Ukrainian, the fact that it was committed on Ukrainian territory gives the ICC jurisdiction. So yeah, the ICC does have jurisdiction for crimes committed in Ukraine because Ukraine is a member state. Now, enforcement of that and the reality of arresting people who are no longer in Ukraine, who are in a state that is actually not a member state, that's a much more complicated thing, but it's a matter of jurisdiction. Russian troops who commit crimes in Ukraine absolutely can be prosecuted at the ICC.
All right, thank you. I have kind of a question. I actually have two questions that are, you've been talking a lot about Europe and so forth, but I'm curious about where China and India play in all of this. I mean, obviously, we've seen that China and India have continued to support Russia with, India by buying oil, and China, it's not clear what they're doing, but obviously they're probably supplying arms and so forth. So, in terms of their connection to the ICC or not, and how does their behavior kind of reinforce Russia's activities?
Well, that's a great question. And this is something Svetlana and I talked about, and we didn't get into it in this conversation. But it's one of the really troubling sort of what might happen in the future questions, I think. So first of all, China is not a member of the is not a member state of the ICC, but I frame this as my starting point would be Hong Kong in terms of China testing the waters of what the European Union and the UK, but also sort of the Western democratic states, what our tolerance for Chinese aggression in the sense of political aggression, right? So you had the agreement of two systems when Hong Kong was handed back to China, and that of course has been completely overridden. There is no more democracy. There's a mass detentions and prosecutions, and I think that sent a very bad message that no one stood up for local rule in Hong Kong. But I think that to connect it to Ukraine, I think that my own view, and I'd be interested to hear what Svetlana says, is that I think that this is a terrible precedent for Taiwan. I think that that is what China is looking at. And I think that the argumentation of, because of course it's the same, right? Like, and this is why it's really important to understand the imperial root of what Russia actually thinks is happening, that Ukraine is Russian territory, that this is a made up Western national identity and that it is actually Russian, that this is the same for China in terms of how they view Taiwan. It's a matter of national anger, like very real anger, and that is, for them, that is what reunification is. And so the logic of the justification of aggressive warfare between Russia and Ukraine and China and Taiwan is the same, which for me is why I think that it makes perfect sense why China would take a position of supporting Russia. I would also just add that the European Union has been, as another thing that we didn't get into in this conversation, but I think that one of the major failures in terms of the EU has positioned itself is its over reliance on Russian energy, and that it has not taken that seriously, and it's had a decade to make itself be more in a stronger position, and it didn't take that opportunity. But I don't know, Svetlana, if you have any.
Yeah, I mean, I'm completely in agreement with what you're saying, because the energy question is very important. And it's very interesting. At one point, when I was giving a lecture about that, I pulled up a map of Russian oil and gas pipelines into Europe, and it looks like a bony arm stretching and just grabbing. Like it has like it actually has five big flows, and it just looks like in a horror movie, when you're starting to see like the shadow of the bony fingers in like old black and white horror movies. That's what the Russian pipelines look like going into Europe. And through a lot of soft power, political pressure, and outright bribery of European officials. And it seems like Germany has been especially susceptible to that with Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. Russia essentially has put Europe, as in Ukraine, we call it on the needle. It's to put someone on the needle, which is to make them an addict, right? Or make them reliant on something. And so when the annexation of Crimea took place in 2014, we talked about political response, not having appetite for military involvement. But at that point in time, to not even start considering diversification of your energy supply away from Russia is sheer insanity and such complacency with an aggressor state who used to, I mean, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet Union invaded Poland in 1939. They still want it back, right? So for these countries to not start to move away from Russian oil and gas, to then in 2022 find themselves in a situation where they would give Ukraine 123 billion euros in aid, but then pay Russia 133 billion euros a year for their oil and gas. And it's like, actually, we're giving Ukraine negative 10 billion because we're sponsoring 10 billion more in Russian warfare capabilities than we're actually giving Ukraine to defend itself. It was completely insane. And with China, absolutely. If the world fails Ukraine, Taiwan is next, in my opinion.
You didn't address India.
India is a more subtle player for sure, but they're certainly they're a little bit more opportunistic. I don't think they're as entrenched ideologically as China is, with having this sort of situation in Taiwan that they're wanting to see how to play. India is just very opportunistic. India is very happy to buy cheap Russian oil and gas. India is also very happy to buy grain that Russia stole from occupied Ukrainian territories and is selling to India for cheap. But also, when President Trump threatened them with 500% tariffs for buying Russian oil, they said they would stop. So it's not as strong of a connection to Russia ideologically as it is for China. It's more, in my opinion, it's more opportunistic. It's cheap stuff. They have a lot of people. They need a lot of stuff.
Are they a member of the ICC, India?
I do not actually know. I don't believe so, but I don't know. I would have to check that.
Okay. I do have one more question. I'm sorry. I hate to take over here, but I got the mic, I guess. Gaza. Has Gaza distracted Europe and the rest of the world from what's going on in Ukraine?
Let me say this. I would say that yes, in the sense that from like a sort of factual perspective of like we look at like media coverage, etc. I think that the bigger issue is, does it have to be a distraction, or can we hold multiple things in our head at the same time and care about multiple things? Yes, we can, and we actually should. So we should be able to care just as much and be just as engaged on Ukraine as we may feel about Gaza, as we may feel for myself on the Democratic Republic of the Congo, on Sudan. So I don't, I think, again, like from a factual perspective, yes, that's how the media works, right? They want to focus on the one story, but it's a premise that I don't agree with. I don't think it should be that way. I think we should be able to care about atrocities, humanitarian crises, wars and conflicts wherever they are, and as many as there are.
All right. Thank you. Svetlana, you have a thought about Gaza? And I'm just thinking about Congress, the U.S. Congress, in terms of, whether they can hold two thoughts in their head at one time, I guess is the question.
So I would say three things. One, all of us should deeply care about the concept of global justice. And that should include Ukraine, and that should include Sudan, and that should include the environment. If you have never had a chance to, look up the term ecocide in Ukraine and the amount of environmental damage that is being done, from burning out old growth forests with warfare to the explosion and to the Russians blowing up the Kakhovka hydropower plant, to Russian forces hunting and doing safari in Ukraine's largest biosphere reserve. Those places deserve justice as well. So aspirationally, I think we all should care about global justice. As far as the Congress, they are way above my pay grade, and they get paid to care about a lot of things at a time, and they should care about a lot of things at a time. For me personally, because I have my mother in Ukraine, I have my family and my friends in Ukraine. My mom's office was heavily damaged during the January 9th attack. My uncle's apartment's windows blew out during the most recent attack. I am choosing the cause of Ukraine as the primary choice and cause of my life. And I do not have enough historical understanding and context to speak about other conflicts without making a fool of myself. So I prefer not to.
Okay.
And maybe, Ray, if I could just add that in terms of the seriousness of like what it means that we may have a loss of attention, I would say that the bigger issue is not the media moving on or there being other conflicts that are taking up space, but it's actually the proliferation of Russian misinformation and disinformation in the United States that is causing this to like not have the support that it should have. I truly believe that's much more a real danger right now. And that we see this particularly on social media. It's incredible how much disinformation you come across about Ukraine.
Yeah.
Thank you. So if either of you would have a concluding comment, and then we'll turn it back to Betty after that.
Well, I know that one thing that Erin and I talked about in terms of sort of wrapping things up and giving people some tangible things to get plugged into. For those of you who are local in Indiana, if you want to continue the conversation with Ukrainians and kind of understand what our life is like, both back in Ukraine and here in Indiana, Ukrainian Society of Indiana is our community hub. We have a lot of various events, book clubs, Ukrainian language learner cafes. We're about to open a Ukrainian school for children, which is a very exciting project. So for anyone who sort of wants to continue the conversation and get to know the people, I would recommend a local resource. And you can find us just by Googling Ukrainian Society of Indiana and finding our website, or you're welcome to reach out to me directly, and I can answer any questions you might have.
Thank you.
And I would second what Svetlana said. I think that is, if there's any sort of what can you do, please get in contact with Svetlana and her organization. It's an incredibly important way to stay active. I just want to thank you, Ray, and the council and Svetlana for this conversation and for everyone who attended. I am not Ukrainian. My engagement with Ukraine is a part of my work, but as you spend time in places and you spend time with people, you become very emotionally attached. And so I do have that in terms of Ukraine and in terms of particularly the extraordinary survivors that I work with. And it's always for me a really humbling thing to be able to try to speak in a way that honors their experience and to share as much as I can what they would like those outside of Ukraine to hear. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to do that.
All right, and thank you. And Betty?
Well, you're not off the hook yet, Erin. I was just thinking that I didn't have any questions tonight. I always have a question, but I just thought of one. And you may have addressed it, but I have a final coming up, and my students have been texting me urgently, like maybe at the last minute they can save themselves. Very quickly, if you could, please don't take too much time because I know people are anxious to. Is EU moving us out of the picture, or at least as we dither, is the EU be able, if they had to go it alone, do they have the capacity, the resources, and everything to really assist Ukraine sufficiently to just shut off Putin once and for all, or not?
I would say no.
Oh,
Where the European Union is currently, that they need the United States.
and I suppose Trump uses this as a leverage.
Trump has excluded the EU. I mean, they're not even really at the table, and they do have a role to play. And I think that it's greatly exaggerated and frankly terrible, just international relations generally, the way that the U.S. administration is behaving. But I don't think that it's false to say that the EU, because of decisions and actions that it's taken, is in a very weak position, and it would not be able to defend Ukraine on its own without the United States. That's
yeah. I hate to hear that because it's a situation they may be forced into. Thank you both very much. This has been a wonderful program. It will be on a recording, which will be wonderful because I know there are several people who wanted to come this evening, but today is Ash Wednesday. This week is Ramadan, Ash Wednesday, and the Lunar New Year. And if anything screams diversity, that is an example of it. And so there are a lot of people who couldn't attend this evening. And I wish we had looked forward to realize, oops, Ash Wednesday, this is probably not a good night for us to compete with. But there'll be many people who will be looking at the recording. All those in the council have gotten several requests about this. I almost got to Ukraine. It was going to be my fourth Fulbright. I applied, I'd been accepted, and then Putin intervened, and that did not happen. I was willing to go, but they were not going to be sending anybody in at that time. I was being assisted by Katrina Yushchenko. And yeah, she was just really marvelous. She was just sort of dictating, well, you go to this school, you go there. First, she thought it'd be a good idea if I went east because the people there really needed to know more about this. They said, oh, that's probably not a good idea. Maybe we better get you over the Western sector. But thank you very much. This has been a wonderful program. You had a very attentive audience. I can see from the nod of several heads that, yeah, this has been very good. And I want to thank you very much. Both of you brought tremendous depth and knowledge, firsthand knowledge that isn't often captured. I think all of our speakers, we choose them because of the profound expertise and what they know, but you, both of you in particular, because you are on the ground and in the trenches, so to speak, really have brought to us. And I did not know, for example, that Putin was sending back the children that they captured as soldiers. I just choke when I say that. The man is just nothing, there's no bottom to his cruelty. No bottom. And that's the danger what we're dealing with, because you're dealing with a madman who has no bottom of cruelty. So there's nothing reasonable. Well, thank you both very much. I want to say next week we have, again on Wednesday night, will be our speaker talking about tariffs. How our tariffs have just sort of upended the free market, the trade markets in the world. And I bring this up to my students right now because I talk about Adam Smith a lot, Wealth of Nations, and how he really liked the free market economy, the capitalist system, and free trade. And historically, every if we look at our own history, just our own history, every season of terrorists is followed by a season of a severe dip in the economy. And this is just, it's historic. So please come next week. I know this will interest you. You have to register to get a link. And that will be our last program for March. We'll have 4 more programs in February. We have 4 more programs in March. You are a fantastic audience. Thank you so much. If you're new, please come back.